Hello everyone, back to today's third video. We're going to have some more analogues for you for the spring coming up for today's first video. So we've got part 3, if you like, of our spring 2018 analogues. This will be the final analogues update, because next week, just a week's time, we will release and issue the GWV Spring 2018 forecast. So we're very close now to the end of the updates for the spring. So I'll take you through the analogues that we're looking at for today's part 3 of Spring 2018 analogues in a second. Just to say that later on today we'll have the GWV Sunny Roundup, and then this evening there'll be some sort of update. It probably will be on Ensembles Watch, so we'll have a look and see what the day runs of the computer models are showing. Sorry, it's been a very long few days as we've been playing around with the chance of this severe cold weather. I've been doing loads and loads of updates, so I'm pretty tired. So I hope you bear with me if I get a little bit tongue-tied and get a bit mixed up during this analogues update. So that's what's coming up today at website. The GWV Sunny Roundup will be with you after lunchtime, just after lunch, and then the final video, the Ensembles Watch, or whatever we do, will be this evening, probably around 7 o'clock. Also, this analogues update going to be quite a long video, and it will be placed on the Spring 2018 updates and forecast page. There'll be a written summary that goes with that. That'll be sometime this evening as well. So a lot going on at the website. So, just talk you through the analogues. Our good friend James Ackrill has been beavering away, getting all of these together. So, we've already looked at ENSO and solar activity in terms of this spring, but for this final part 3 spring analogues update, I thought we'd have a look at the winter patterns, and specifically focusing on February, the month that's just before the spring, of course. So it's been quite hard to get this together. It's been a very unusual winter in a lot of ways. Very difficult to pin down this winter as one thing or another, because there's been so much chopping and changing. But what we're going to start off looking at is simply springs that follow colder than average February. So let's get on with it. I'm going to start off by looking at the Central England temperature, just to confirm that we are colder than average, and I think we will probably come out colder than average for this February. It will just depend how cold it is. So far provincially, up to the 16th of February, the CET is standing at 3.3 degrees. Remember, this Central England temperature, and the anomaly there is 0.4 of a degree below average. If you compare that to a more modern average, like 81 to 2010, a warmer average, then it would be a bigger deviation than that showing. So we're around half a degree colder than average. It may tick up a little bit over the next couple of days, but I think it'll fall back again as we get through towards month end. Of course, if we do get that very cold easterly spell that we've been playing around with in the model output over recent days, then it could actually come out as quite a cold February when we get to the very end of the month. So I'm going to judge how cold this February might be, and what we're going to look at first of all is colder than average Februaries with CETs between 3 and 4 degrees, and what they could mean for the spring. Now, there's so many of them that I can't go through each individual year. So this is what we've come out with for March. These are all of the years, all of the Marches, if you like, that follow Februaries that were between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius. So colder than average, but only a little bit colder than average. We start at March 1892, and we go right the way down to 2012. So there's a big range of years in there, and of course I can't show you all of those individually because we'd be here for a month of Sundays really, but if we put all those years together, you can just see how much work James has had to go through to get to this point, putting all of these years together. So a big thank you to James as always for his help and input in getting these analogues together. I couldn't do these analogues updates that we do in the seasonal updates. I couldn't do them on my own, I just wouldn't have the time. So a big thank you, as always, to the wondrous James Acrill for all of his help. Not just with this video, but with all of the analog stuff that we do at GWV in the longer range output. So, getting back to what we're looking at as Marches that follow Februaries that were within the 3 to 4 degrees Celsius CET range. And if you combine all of those years, so we can't show them individually, but if you was to combine all of those years, this is what you come out with. And overall, it is quite a cold-looking signal for March. We find that we get a fairly big area of above average heights around Greenland, with below average heights underneath it, a southerly tracking jet stream there as well. So we're pulling cold air into that trough. That looks like a pretty cold signal for March. Do bear in mind there are several years in there that are deviating. So for example, we've got 2012, which would be a pretty mild March, to say the least. That was a warm March, but we've also got some very cold Marches in there. Let's try and find one. So how about 1987? That was a very cold March indeed. But what if you combine all of those years? That's what you come out with, and it is, despite that there are deviations, there is overall a cold blocking signal for March. Now this is April composite, so again this is following Februaries that were in 3 and 4 degree Celsius CET range, and this is for April. What we see for April is a very different pattern compared to March. It looks much more active and much more mobile with these Aprils. So we have high pressure to our south and southwest, we have deep low pressure to the north, below average heights are up here, and we've got a very strong jet stream coming through the country as well. So after a cold, potentially quite wintry March, we possibly go into, yes, a rather milder April, but also quite an unsettled April, particularly so for northern parts of the country. So spring gets going in April, if you like, but it is an unsettled April. Again, bear in mind there is a big range of years. We can't show you all of those years individually. We start at 1892 and we go all the way down again to 2012. So you've got a range of scenarios playing out, but if you put all of the years together, that is the composite that you come out with for April, following Februaries with CETs between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius. And then we go through to May. Again, same idea. These Mays are all following Februaries that have central England temperatures between 3 and 4 degrees, so just a little bit colder than average. So these are Mays, if you like, but are slightly following slightly colder than average Februaries. What we see is that, interestingly, we do get the blocking pattern coming back to some degree around Greenland. So after we lose the blocking pattern in April, after a strong blocking signal in March, it comes back a little bit in May, and May also placing this trough right over top of the country. So it looks like an unsettled signal here. And whether this would be all that cold, I'm not sure, because we do also have some above average heights down across Spain and Portugal, so that's trying to bring warmth up from the south, but of course we're blocking to the north, trying to entrench cold air into that trough. So I suspect there's a range of years here. Some of them are probably quite cold with May, and some of them are probably quite warmer, but quite a bit warmer. But what we can say is that it is an unsettled signal, this, for these Mays that are following slightly colder than average Februaries. Really unsettled with a trough of low pressure parked over top of the country. So fairly mixed bag really for the spring for these years that are following slightly colder than average Februaries. Now, if we look at the spring composite altogether, so this is taking the Marches, the Aprils and the Mays, putting them together as a seasonal sort of anomaly. This is what we come out with for the composite. So we find that we've got below average heights to our south with these springs, and also over UK with above average heights around Greenland. So there is a blocking signal for these springs. And overall, I think the jet stream is a bit southerly as well, so it looks like a fairly, I have to say, it looks like a fairly unsettled signal for these springs that are following slightly colder than average Februaries. And we saw from the individual breakdown of the months that there is a lot of intra-month variation going on, but overall I think quite cold and or quite cool and unsettled spring can be expected. Now, if we was to get a colder February than between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius, we would probably be between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius. Now, I'm not saying that we will get that. It will be determined by whether we pull in the beast from the east in the closing days. As I'm doing this video on the evening of Saturday the 2nd, on the evening of Saturday the 17th of February. I told you it's been a very long day, didn't I? So I'm doing the video on the evening of Saturday, 17th February 2018. And at this point, I can't say whether we will pull in that severely cold air from the east and unleash the beast from the east. If we do, then we will probably come out with a central England temperature of between 2 and 3 degrees. So in this box, what you will see, instead of showing a CET in the threes, it will show a CET that is 2 point something. I don't think we can go any lower than 2. I don't think we're going to go to below 2 Celsius. I think it's too late in the month to be able to do that. Famous last words, but I don't think we will. So the CET, if it does turn very cold in the final stage of February, the CET will either range from something like 2.0 to 2.9 perhaps. So the next composite that we're going to look at is springs and individual spring months that follow Februaries that are within the 2 to 3 degrees Celsius range. So these are colder Februaries, and this is what the results are for the springs that follow those proper cold Februaries. We begin again in March, so this is all years combined. Again, we can't show you those months individually because there's too many of them. We start at March 1864 and we go all the way down to March 2010. So this is how it looks. If we combine all of those years, we find that a very strong block signal, stronger perhaps for this composite, even compared to the previous Marches we were just looking at, which were in the range of Marches following Februaries that were only slightly colder than average. These, remember, the Marches that follow proper cold Februaries, and we find that we have a very strong blocking signal centering around Greenland and Iceland, and then we have a trough of below average heights underneath that block across Western Europe. So this is no beating about the bush about this. Is a very strong cold signal, potentially very cold signal for these Marches. I would suspect, well, there will be deviation within the Analogues package, I'm sure, and there will be a few Marches which do show a milder pattern. I reckon a lot of these Marches, with to get such a strong signal, a lot of these Marches would be really cold months indeed. Then we go through to April, and again, remember, these are Aprils that are following Februaries that have CETs between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius, so genuinely proper cold Februaries. And unlike what we saw in the previous Analogues package for the slightly colder than average Februaries, what we see here is a continuation to these Aprils of the blocking pattern. So with those slightly colder than average Februaries, the Aprils that followed them, we saw a reversion back to an Atlantic driven pattern, and we lost that blocking signal. That's not the case for these Aprils that follow proper cold Februaries, genuinely below average Februaries, because we keep the blocking pattern going with these Aprils overall. A strong blocking signal around Greenland, and then we get this area below average heights to our east, which means we remain on the cold side of the jet stream. We will be pulling the air down in that sort of direction. So Aprils that follow proper cold Februaries, as opposed to being slightly cold on average, is a much stronger signal to maintain cold conditions potentially well into the spring. And look at this, we go through to May, and again, the Mays that are following those genuinely cold Februaries with CETs between 2 and 3 degrees, they also are coming out with a substantial blocking pattern. So it looks like if you get a really genuinely cold February, it looks like it's very hard to shake it off as you get into the spring. So we keep that strong blocking pattern going over Greenland and close to Iceland for these Mays, and then we keep the below average heights going to our east, and we remain, I would have thought, on the cold side of the jet doing something rather like that. So it's interesting the difference there between the two different kinds of Februaries. If it's just a slightly colder than average February, then although you tend to start off quite cold in March, it does revert by April back to a milder and more Atlantic driven pattern as you lose the blocking. But if you have a genuinely cold February, which would be a CET under 3 degrees, then all bets are off, really. You might keep that cold weather extending well into the spring. Possibly the blocking pattern goes on into April. Again, bear in mind, there's a big range of years. We start at 1864. We finish again down at 2010. So big range, but I think it's fairly compelling, the evidence here, that overall, if you have a proper cold February, it's really hard to shake that off as you get through into the spring. This is how the springs look if we combine all of those Marches, Aprils and Mays following those cold Februaries. This is what we come out with, and it is a clearer cut cold signal. So we have a strong area below average heights to our south and southeast. We have a big blocking feature around Greenland, and we'd be on the cold side of the jet stream doing something like that with the flow and the jet. So quite interesting, the difference between a slightly milder than average February and what that means for the spring. Probably starts off quite cold but doesn't sustain it, and what it means if you have a genuinely cold February. You might keep that cold weather running well into the spring. You might come out with a particularly cold and pretty miserable season overall. So that's Februaries on their own, but what about if you add to this mild January? So the next thing we're going to look at is January and February, because we know what happened in January. Even if February comes out colder than average, and I think it will, it'll just be a question of how cold it is. But even if February comes out colder than average, January was a genuinely milder than average month. It had an anomaly of 1.5 degrees above average in the CET region, coming out at 5.3. So our next batch of analogues that James has got together is looking at mild Januaries with CETs between 4.5 and 5.5 degrees, and then cold Februaries, but only slightly colder than average. So essentially these springs that we're looking at are following mild Januaries and slightly colder than average Februaries. Again, we start in March and we find that there's not as big a range of years for these, of course, because we've got January narrowing down our sort of field, if you like, of possible years. So we're beginning at 1874 and we're going down to 2012, but there aren't as many years in between. But it's still a similar story, really, for these Marches that follow milder than average Januaries and slightly colder than average Februaries. We get a blocking signal around Greenland again, and then we get below average heights underneath it in that sort of position and over there around Greenland. So we do something a little bit like that. That's wrong. We do something a little bit like that with the flow, with the jet stream. It's not quite as clear a cut of cold signal as we saw for those Marches that are following very cold Februaries, or genuinely cold Februaries, But even so, there is still a blocking signal in evidence there. Then we go through to April. Remember what we're looking at again here is mild Januaries with slightly colder than average Februaries, and what we see again is that overall we have the below average heights to our east in that sort of position, above average heights out to the west, and also still a bit of a blocking signal up to the north. This is going again from 1874 to 2012. Then we move through to May. So again, these are mild Januaries with slightly colder than average Februaries. And what we find for May is very similar. The blocking signal is coming back with below average heights to our south and a strong blocking ridge up to the north. So we lose a blocking signal a little bit in April after a very blocked March, but then it comes back quite a lot as we get through into May. If we combine those years, again, we come out with a very similar story. We come out with above average heights around Greenland and Iceland, with below average heights over Scandinavia and extending through Western Europe, and overall we would be quite cold. So the various scenarios playing out here seem to be favouring the chance of quite a blocked and cold spring, but bear in mind there is quite a range of outcomes. Now, another way of looking at this is to compare the height anomaly and the pressure anomaly that we've had during February 2018 with previous years. We've had a go at doing that, but actually there aren't all that many years that we can compare this February to. This is how the 500 millibar height anomaly for February 2018 is looking up to the 15th of February. So we find that we have below average heights to our north and extending through the UK. It's a complicated pattern. Above average heights are out in the middle of the Atlantic, and then there's quite a blocking signal going on up here to our northeast. So it has been quite an unsettled month at times, and it's also been quite a cold month because we've been on the cold side of the jet. The jet's been doing something rather like that, which has been the case throughout much of winter, actually. We've been pulling in at times for the north, anyway, quite cold air, even though January was quite a mild month down in the south. Of the north, it was actually colder month even then, and that's the reason. So that's the reason that we've had a relatively cold February up to now. The jet stream has been doing that sort of position, or it's been in that sort of position. So James has done his best to try and find some matches for the February pattern that we've had this year. There's only really two that we've been able to come up with, or James was able to come up with. The first one is February 1951, which is a very interesting year, and I'll talk about that more a little bit later in the video. But this is how the 500 millibar height anomaly looks for February 1951. Unsettled, below average heights extending through the UK. We have a ridge through the central part of the Atlantic in February 1951, and we have quite a blocking signal to our northeast. Looks like we do something like that with the flow, with the jet stream. Just compare that to February 2018, and it is quite similar, I have to say. It's not identical, and you never get like for like, really, with the weather. But I think overall, that is a pretty decent match for February 2018 and February 1951. And then the only other real match that James was able to come up with was February 1981. And this isn't as close, but it's kind of similar. We had the ridge in the middle of the Atlantic. We have some ridging over there across Scandinavia, February 1981, and then we have below average heights in between it, albeit not as much as February 1951 and not as much as February 2018. It's the same sort of flow, and it's the same sort of idea, but I think out of the two, 1951 is probably the closest. February 1951. This is how the spring of 1951 played out. So March 1951, you have a ridge up to the north and to the northwest of the country, below average heights through the UK. So quite a coolish looking signal really for March 1951, and probably quite unsettled too. April 1951 looks like that. This looks like it was an unsettled spring. We have below average heights generally over and to the northern British Isles, a ridge through the middle of the Atlantic, and I think we'll be doing something like that, the flowing with the jet stream. So quite unsettled again. That's not overly cold, it's Atlantic driven, but quite unsettled in April 1951. And then May 1951 looks very poor. We get this blocking feature set up around Iceland, and then we have deep below average heights underneath it to the south with that trough. So we do something like that with the flow and with the jet stream. It looks like the pattern gets progressively worse, I'm afraid, as we go through the spring of 1951. That's how the spring of 1951 comes out. If you combine March to May, it looks like it's an unsettled signal with below average heights across much of northern Western Europe, a ridge in the middle of the Atlantic. So probably quite cool and probably quite an unsettled spring, not the best spring by any means in 1951. Then we got 1981, and that wasn't quite as good a match, but this is how March 1981 looks. It's a very unsettled month with deep below average heights in the Atlantic. A little bit of a blocking signal up to the north, but I don't think it was overly cold really this month. It's just really quite unsettled with a strong jet stream bringing low pressure in from off the Atlantic. April 1981 is an interesting month. This is how the anomaly looks overall for April 1981. High pressure above average height centred just to our northwest. The interest with April 1981 is that right at the end of the month there was a classic late spring blizzard that occurred right at the end of April 1981. I've actually done a historic video about that in the past. It was a very severe cold spell that occurred at the end of April 1981. And then this is how May 1981 looks, and again, very unsettled month. We have above average heights well away from us, no help with the Azores high. There is a bit of a ridge across northern Scandinavia, but that doesn't do much for us. So what we're left with in May 1981 is just this very, very deep trough just to the west of the British Isles, which brings that strong westerly jet stream through, and no doubt quite a lot of heavy rain coming in and pretty cool conditions during May 1981. That's how the spring of 1981 looks as an anomaly overall. So it's an unsettled spring with below average heights to our south, and then we have above average heights to the north, and we bring the flow through rather like that. Less of a blocking signal, but there was a very impressively cold spell during the course of April. But I do think it's February. February 1951 that is the closest match out of the two. So again, that is February 1951. That's February 2018, and I think they're a pretty decent match. You never get like for like, as I say, but I think they're a pretty decent match. And 1951 is interesting and useful as an analogue because it was a year that was cropping up a lot in our winter updates. The winter of 1950-1951 was a winter that was right at the very, very top end, really, of the analogues that we was looking at for our winter updates. By the way, this is what it looks like if you combine the springs of 1951 and 1981 all together, with below average heights to our south and above average heights to the north. So quite a coolish looking signal, but I think that's more down to 1951 than it is to 1981. But just to finish off, coming back to the winter updates, because as I was saying, the year of 1950-1951 was a winter that was showing up a lot in the winter updates. And when we came to bring it all together to issue the GWV Winter 2017-18 forecast, which I think has gone reasonably well. I'm actually very happy with the analogues. Maybe not quite so much with my forecast, but I think James's analogues have been uncannily accurate, really, for this winter, and we'll discuss that more when we get to the end of the winter, of course, but I'm very pleased how the analogues have performed this year. So this is how the analogues look for the winter forecast, just to give you a quick recap, and there is 1951 cropping up just there, by the way, winter of 1950-1951. So what we had with our analogues, and I won't go through the methodology of the GWV winter forecast at this point, because there are several elements that came together, but the best years that matched our winter forecast methodology were these: 1922, 1951, 1962, 1963, 1996, 1997, 2002, and 2013. And that's how the winter analogue came out for those years, with above average heights to the north and below average heights to the south. I won't break them down into monthly analogues that we issued where we did winter forecast, but they have held up quite well. So if we were just to extend on with those winter analogues into the spring, this is what we come out with. This is March. This is how the Marches look if we keep those analogue years going. Remember, we're going from 1922 down to 2013. This is how the Marches come out, and it is quite a strong signal. It takes us back really to where we started with these analogues, with the cold Februaries. It is quite a strong signal for below average heights to be to the north, to the south rather, and above average heights to be to the north. We're on the cold side of the jet stream, got a southerly tracking jet stream going trenching cold air into that trough with these Marches. Now, this is how April looks, and again, it is quite interesting because it does go back to what we was just, how we started this analogues update, looking at the springs and the March and the Aprils and Mays that follow the cold Februaries. And you notice that the blocking signal reduces a lot with these Aprils. So we find that we do have a little bit of a blocking signal here, but it is much less compared to what we have in March. Below average heights to the north, and then above average heights to the southwest. So spring is trying to get itself going, if you like. After a cold and wintry March, we finally get spring revving itself up and trying to get itself going anyway in the Aprils. But then we go through to the Mays, and things deteriorate rapidly with these Mays. That remember, these are the years that were used for our winter forecast. So this is how the Mays look, and we find a real deterioration with a deep trough of below average height centred almost slap bang over top of the UK, with above average heights in the Atlantic, and also a little bit of a blocking signal, jet streams doing something like that. So this tells us that we have quite an interesting spring with these years that we used in the winter analogues and the winter forecast. We have a really cold signal for March. We have spring getting itself going in a much better month for April, and then it goes into a rapid deterioration with a really unsettled May. And that is how the springs of these years look overall. So remember, the years are 1922, 1951, 1962, 1963, 1996, 1997, 2002, and 2013. And we find that overall we have below average heights to our south and a blocking signal up to the north. Keep in mind, a lot of that blocking is happening in March. We don't get as much of it in April and May. April is a better month, but May shows a real decline in the pattern and a real deterioration. So that's it for part 3 of the Spring 2018 analogues, and we've pretty much come to the end now. All we've got left to do is one final seasonal model roundup for the spring of 2018. We'll do that next Saturday, the final Saturday of the month. I think it's around 24th of February. And then the day after that, Sunday 25th, that's when we're going to release the GWV Spring 2018 forecast. So what we'll do is we'll put these analogues that we've just been looking at here together with the analogues we've looked at so far for this season, which is ENSO and solar activity. We'll bring it all together and we'll combine it with the long-range seasonal models, and we will release the GWV Spring 2018 forecast a week today. And at nearly 35 minutes, all that remains is to say thanks very much for watching. Remember, this video will be placed on the Spring Updates and Forecast page with a written summary going over everything that was discussed in the video later on today. Coming up just after lunchtime, we'll have the GWV study roundup, and then this evening, I suspect we'll have some sort of video, whether we're looking at midday runs of models or maybe doing an ensembles watch. You'll know a little bit later on, but there will be a third video coming up at website today. And at 35 minutes just gone, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.